good afternoon. This is Richard Hsu, host of Hsu Untied. I'm very pleased and thrilled to have with me as my guest Jeff Frick, who's the founder and CEO of Menlo Creek Media, also the founder of Work 20XX. Jeff, welcome to the program.
Thank you, Richard. Great to see you today. Thanks for having me on.
So, Jeff, your name was referred to me by another previous guest that I had named Gary Bowles, and I have started a series on really the future of work, a topic which I believe you know a lot about and have been talking about long before the pandemic. So, why don't we just kind of start with that? Like, what do you kind of see for the future of work now that the pandemic is kind of over or sort of over?
Right. So I think there's a couple of really big megatrends that kind of came out, and here we are today. So the first one I think is that, kind of the pandemic was this accelerant to a lot of transformations that were already kind of underway. And if you think about work specifically, we've been working from planes, trains, automobiles, hotels, and taxis for a long time, but there was still kind of this tether. So now we know that actually it's possible. Another thing that's changed is we're in this increasingly dynamic world, right? So we all know the stats that the Fortune 500 duration for any particular company is less and less. And I had a great interview with Michael Biltz from Accenture, which just talks about this world now is so dynamic and changes so quickly. You need to really more index around flexibility a lot more than you did before, because the markets that you played in may not exist tomorrow. And we saw, kind of really what's possible with COVID. Another thing is the digitization of so many things, including work, which really now has got to a critical mass. And now you combine that with kind of the realities of wireless is finally here, between cloud, super powerful handsets, 5G, 6G, Wi-Fi 6. So kind of all these confluence of things have kind of come together. And oh yes, we actually delivered the goods for 2 years. So it's a very different world than the world that we entered, in February of 2020. So I think that's the first thing. The second thing is we have the systemic labor shortage. Folks like you and I that are a little more gray on top are retiring. Families are smaller. People are having kids later. So this tightness within the talent pool is not going away. So the competition for talent is only going to get more and more extreme. So I think there's a real opportunity in what COVID has given us is to rethink what work and workplace can be, to leverage the digital tools and things that we have, and really rethink the art of what's possible. And I think when you talk to the workplace professionals who we talk to on the Work 20XX show, that's really what you get, is this really sense of enthusiasm, because they're like, oh my goodness, we've been trying to tell people this forever, but now suddenly COVID forced people to acknowledge what's possible.
Well, one of the things I've observed and through the series of dialogue also that I've been talking to is that, we were much more remote than people kind of acknowledge. I mean, that's the whole funny thing is people are saying, well, it's time to go back to the office. But the reality is that just a lot of work, I mean, probably the majority of work was already being done remotely and just by distributed teams, people working in different offices. And yes, maybe they were working in offices, but they weren't working together in the same office. So really, if they're working in different offices already, then what difference does it make if they're working at home, right? I mean, that certainly was going on well before the pandemic, really.
Right. And you don't have to think that hard, right? I mean, what did all offices suffer? There was never enough conference rooms. There's never enough conference rooms. There was never enough place to actually do what offices are good for, which is get together to do heavy collaborative work or heavy social work, right? And I talked to Brian Anderson from Miller Knoll, right? And they've had sensors just for energy and occupancy. He's like, people haven't been at their desk for a very long time. So this is not new. There was this kind of a fiction that there was so many people in the office, and in fact they weren't. And it's kind of overcoming this idea that I have to have my space, and I used to have my little badge on my cube, and moving to more of a shared kind of thought process in terms of how you share space. And the really the big one is activity-based. That's the one that's so different. And when you start rethinking what an office can be, and you start from activity-based, now suddenly think back to the banking commercials where suddenly a bank looked like a coffee shop, and start to think like a restaurateur. Why do you go to a restaurant instead of cooking at home? Because there's just some experiences that are better that you can't get at home. Well, you take a step back, Mr. real estate facilities people, how can you make it an attractive people that people want to come to be productive to do the things they can't do at home, which is not email and not video conferencing. That's better done at home with no commute.
Yeah. Well, I want to talk about that in a second, but I think the thing I was going to say was that I think the same holds true for, a lot of people talk about how, it's hard to get mentoring in younger workers. But again, I think because we really have been working remotely much more than we realize, a lot of that was already happening as well. Your boss was often not in the same office. So you were by default getting mentoring from senior people in different offices or remote locations or whatever. I mean, a lot more of that was going on again than I think people realize that in their mind they weren't thinking remote because maybe they were all in the office but not in the same office, if that makes sense.
Yes and no. I would almost argue that it wasn't going on as much as they think it was because there's this assumption that by serendipitously putting people in proximity to one another, they're going to interact, but you get into all the biases and who has access and do I even have the right to say hi if we get in the elevator together and I'm a junior person? So it's really interesting. What we have tended to do organizationally is over-index on meetings as a way to communicate. And where the real opportunity is to get much better in our best practices around meetings, which means there'll be less meetings, move as much work to async as we can, and then free up this valuable synchronous time like you and I are having right now for more important things like way more one-on-ones, way more getting to know your people, way more making sure they understand the mission and the why behind the task that we're asking them to do. And then this whole concept of servant leadership, right? Or some people prefer the idea of service leadership, which is me as your boss, how can I help you achieve the objectives that we've stated that you're going to achieve using my power, using my resources, using my authority? So it's a very different way. It's, we're on a team, we have different jobs on the team. I'm not going to task manage you, and I don't have time for it anyway. But where do you need help to get a roadblock removed? So it's a really different way to think about how you execute things.
Well, you talked a little bit earlier about more activity-based things. Tell me what are the things that in person, that there is no substitute for in person. What are those?
Right. So Miller Knoll has a great piece of research out that I reference all the time, and there's really three. One is heavy collaborative work, where you want to be in a room together and you're throwing ideas up on the wall and you're using Post-it notes and this, that, and the other. It's better done together. The second kind of category is culture building, and whether that's one-on-ones or whether that's, team building, but, when you want to have those team events, and you'll see even pure remote companies still have all hands events where they build that culture, because we are social beings. And then the third one that doesn't get the play that it should is isolated, almost like a library space, where I just need to go heads down and do some writing or work on a spreadsheet or work on a model or work on a proposal. A lot of people don't have that space at home. So what's interesting, if you think through, they just, Wall Street Journal did a nice piece on the brand new LinkedIn One building that just opened up. And so another kind of concept is busyness and activity and noise. So the beginning of the building, you walk in, it looks like a coffee shop. Some people want to have a bar. So, and then the deeper you get in the building, kind of the more quiet it gets. Another concept that people talk about is neighborhooding. So one of the biggest frustrations in return to office is I get up, I put on a clean shirt and shave, and Richard's not in the office, who I had hoped to see in the office, right? I go in. So neighborhooding is where you start talking about letting the logical unit of the group start establishing the norms of when we'll be in, when we're not going to be in. And then you give them a space in the office that's a collection of different activity-based spaces. So maybe there's a couple cubes, maybe there's a little collab space, maybe there's a phone booth or an isolation space. So even within the neighborhood, based on the different activities, you're going to move around. This LinkedIn space that they just opened, they ripped out 50% of the workstations, and there's over 75 different types of seating configurations. It's really amazing. Things
where is this space? Is LinkedIn in San Francisco, or where is it?
I think it's in Cupertino. I get mixed up where the new one is. It's down in the valley somewhere. And then of course Google just opened their new spaces. And another big concept is kind of democratization of light, democratization of clean air, not only to see it and have it, but to even demonstrate it actively, to let people know, you do have clean air. And a lot of these, things that make the office more attractive, make it the place that people want to come. But the other really interesting thing, Richard, is is units of measure, right? Things slip and we measure things in the units we measure. The return to office chorus is about days. When we organize our lives as we did for this meeting in hours or minutes or blocks of hours and minutes. So a lot of the flexibility is not that I necessarily don't want to go in, but I can't get in until 9:30 because I have to drop the kids off, or I got to leave at 4 because I got to take my mom to the doctor, or so it's really kind of flexibility and agency and trust and letting people manage their own calendars, knowing that, we're not at factory jobs. We don't have to be at the machine. Well, some jobs you do, clearly, but for a lot of knowledge worker jobs, you don't have to be at that machine. So give people the agency to manage their own schedule.
Let's talk a little bit about culture, because I think that's one of the things that often gets cited, that companies and corporations aren't going to have the culture if people aren't in the office. How do you respond to that? How does one address that issue?
Right. So a couple ways. One is we always have to be careful not to look through the world through our own eyes. And it's easy to do, and we all do it. But the fact of the matter is that it's a different world with digital natives, and you can have an intimacy electronically that maybe you didn't necessarily expect. It doesn't mean it can't be augmented, but look no further than all the success of digital dating sites that didn't exist when you and I we're just getting out of college and maybe thinking about that. I mean, the internet didn't exist. So there is, I think we have to kind of be careful of what we say in terms of what does or doesn't work. That said, one of the beauties of async, the whole idea of remote work is, again, move as much work to these platforms, to the Asanas and the Atlassians and the WebExes and the Slacks and the Teams, so that you free up the time to spend the time on one-on-one time. And in fact, I interviewed Dave Montes, who's the chief audit officer at PayPal. He spends over 2.5 hours every day in one-on-ones managing an 80-person global team. And he said the intimacy that he gets now, because we're sitting in each other's bedrooms, is actually more than, he got in kind of the corporate environment. So there's certainly benefit to getting together, and you should get together, and it should be part of the routine. That said, if you spend the investment on actually getting to know people, which didn't always happen in the office, there's actually, I think, an opportunity to build tighter culture. There's an interview that's out right now with the CEO of Lacework, name's escaping me, talking about, in their onboarding, they tell every employee that they need to talk to 50 other people from Lacework in the first 30 days as an imperative driven down from the CEO. So that means you're going to be managed against it. So, they're at this other word is intentionality, being much more intentional about how you do things and what you do. A great line is, going back to the office is the new offsite, right? So what does that mean? Well, when you have an offsite, you're very intentional about the purpose. You have stated objectives, you have icebreakers, you have fun stuff, you have hard stuff. So this idea of being more intentional about everything you do, I think is really a key theme.
What about the other thing that often gets cited about being lost in virtual remote work is the whole notion of the inadvertent conversations, the conversations that just spontaneously arrive in the kitchen or in the hallway, on the way to getting a cup of coffee, or those kind of spontaneous get-togethers. What is your thought about that?
Yeah, I mean, there's certainly there's certainly value in those, but those can still happen. They just happen via an IM in a Slack message or an IM I mean, just today, to confirm this today with you, I sent you a LinkedIn instant message. So, there's other tools by which there are opportunities to have these serendipitous engagements. And, one would argue, if you look at the engagement that people have on the apps on their phone, those are pretty engaging. So it's not a substitute for, but it's just different. I think that the idea that should be focused on is, what can I do now that I couldn't do before? Who can I attract that I couldn't attract? How can I enable people that I couldn't enable? Because again, it's back to the mega trends. It's a systemic talent shortage that's not going away and only going to be more competitive. And the younger people coming up, another big trend, right? Their expectations of their work environment is more and more defined by the best apps on their phone, not some crappy green screen HR app that you and I put it up with long ago. So I think there's a real opportunity to embrace what it enables versus kind of focusing on a couple of the words here and there.
Yeah. My sense too is even that area is also, overrated in the sense of, because when you think about it, yes, maybe, 25 years ago that happened a lot and it was done a lot. But really the reality is that, the last five, so years, people are all on their phones anyways. I mean, there isn't much spontaneous. People, even when they're not working, they're either reading their phones, they're not sitting, so I'm not sure how much of that was even really going on as
Right.
much, I
Right.
mean, people are all wrapped up in their work or their laptops or looking at their phones anyway. So there's not much spontaneous
Well,
conversation
they're on
going
different floors, and you're running from meeting to meeting. I mean,
on.
what's really interesting. I mean, I think most of the pushback on the return to office really, I think, is driven by two things. One is just bad managers who now suddenly have to really articulate the objectives they have for their team and manage the objectives, which before they could manage by presenteeism, and that's a whole lot easier, right? So I think that's a big problem. And they need that training, right? They need that training then too to manage in this new world, because what becomes critical component in this new world is that if you can't see if someone's struggling as a manager, how do you know if they're struggling? Well, if you don't create this kind of psychological safety zone and sense of belonging for them to actually make the effort to ask for help, then they won't. And if they do, and you treat them not well, then they're not going to do it again. And here's why this is so important, because then that drives directly back to innovation, right? Scott Cook from Intuit, my favorite line, he says it all the time, right? Build your company on low-cost experimentation. So, kind of innovation by definition is having more people try more experiments, of which by rule, some will fail. So it's in creating that environment of safety where people now are willing to take experiments, risks, and fail because of the way you've treated them when they've had a problem, that's going to drive, kind of this innovation and people now, kind of buying onto the mission. And then, the whole thing, fall in love with the problem, not the solution. And then, let your people figure out the solution and run. There's a lot of, exciting opportunities. Dynamic teams is something that Meg Bear talks about at SAP, this concept of getting to the A-team, right? Or our favorite World War II movies. You brought together, the Dirty Dozen to go take on an assignment. So thinking about making it a little bit more dynamic for the people, as well as, the challenges that you're facing, bring them together, go face a challenge. Maybe at the end of that challenge, they create the group that takes it on. Maybe they train the rest. Maybe they go on to another thing. But, there's a real opportunity to just, get people excited, if you can, about what they're trying to achieve, especially with knowledge workers, right?
Well, let's talk a little bit about where remote work might even be better. Now, I realize obviously commuting is a big thing, but are there certain instances or where, being, remote and working is, arguably even better than doing things in person? What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I mean, so Darren Murph is the guy. If you haven't talked to him, you should put him on your show. He runs remote for GitLab, and they're a 100% remote company. And he will tell you that first off is just the savings on the real estate. Secondly, he would say is that being 100% remote forces you to be good at things that all businesses should be, which is really communication and sharing of information. So if you're 100% remote, and as you said, big companies are all, distributed around the world anyway. No one is in the same time zone.
Yeah.
So if you can't ask somebody sitting next to you or tap them on the shoulder, how do you build an information infrastructure by which people can self-service their own answer? So you need to be really good about documentation, and you also need to be really good about rules of communication, which is, what form of communication should go out on what channel, with what expected reply, and what type of a time frame. And let's all agree that these are the rules of engagement, so that you don't get, a text, an IM, a DM, an email, and a phone call from the same person about the same topic, in the middle of one of your meetings. So I think it forces a discipline that is a little bit, it just makes you be more intentional about culture building. It makes you be more intentional about communications, because you don't have the crutch of just yelling over the wall.
Well, does not Darren, but does the guy GitLab, do they have rules about that? Like, I mean,
yeah, and the greatest part is it's open source and it's published, and you can actually contribute to it. So they have very specific rules. This type of an item goes onto this type of an issue, and this goes into a Slack, and this goes into a such and such, and only the worst things are text, because also you want to have escalation procedures, right? So if I really need to get a hold of you because it's important, I'm sorry to interrupt your day, you have those published as well. But yeah, just and what's two kind of nice things, it's less important to the rules that we agree to respect the rules and treat the rules right, but also that they can change, and we're open to modify them, but reduces this state of anxiety that most of us are in all the time, just waiting for that next notification. And again, by having better meeting and communication discipline, free up blocks of time for people to actually get work done. Because the most frustration we hear all the time, your meetings back to back to back to back to back. When do you actually get your high value work done after the kids are in bed, early in the morning, as opposed to squeezing the email time into crappy little buckets and blocking more hours for that important proposal or that important thing, issue you need to think through, or that walk you need to take to talk about things.
So what's going to prevail then? What's ultimately win? Is it going to be the remote?
It's hybrid. It's hybrid, right? It's going to be hybrid.
It's going to be hybrid. I mean, that's basically where everyone's going to settle, you think?
But the issue is there will be no version of hybrid. So hybrid is undefined, and hybrid will be infinitely variable, even within the same company, even within the same department, even within individuals within the same department. So that's where it's going to be messy and sloppy and painful as everybody tries to figure out what the rules are. And the good news, again, is the workplace professionals have been doing this forever. We just haven't been paying that much attention. So there's a lot of best practices that are published, and it's a lot of where do you establish the group norms? How do you establish group norms? How do you have communication best practices? And then there's just a lot of way more over index on communication, way less index on stupid meetings that we don't need, especially ones that have historical precedents. Just cancel them. Better leverage the modern tools that we have to know whether projects are getting done. So like I had Shani Harmon on, she has a company called Stop Meeting Like This. She's like, you want to give people back to time tomorrow? Cancel your weekly status update. Just cancel it. You have it because you've always had it. Everybody just gives a quick little report, and I have to sit and listen to everybody give a report. If people need help with something, reach out when you need the help and get the help, and let's get the issue resolved. But is there really a reason to have the weekly status meeting? She talks about the inform. Yeah, no, just give me the deck. I can read it myself. I don't have to sit and listen to you read it to me for 45 minutes. So, a lot of just little things that, will make work better. But I think it'll be hybrid, because some days you want to go into the office. As Steve Todd from NASDAQ, the way they think about it is, you want to do focus work, you can't get it done at home. I just want to be able to go to the local WeWork and badge in for 2 hours. I have a great customer presentation. Let's meet downtown at a beautiful high-end, executive briefing center that's got beautiful furniture, high ceilings, Class A space. Oh, we need to do a team get-together? Let's meet at a transit hub that we can all get to easily. We'll meet at the transit hub, do our thing for 2 or 3 hours. Not at 8. Get there at 11 and leave at 1, or whatever's convenient. So again, really starting to think through optionality. Interesting on the flexible real estate is that represents a very small percentage of the commercial real estate now. I think it's way sub 10%, but more and more people are starting to add it to their portfolio. Just think of a more portfolio approach for people versus kind of the central desk location, to your point, which people have been doing sort of anyway. They just didn't want to cop to it.
Right. So what about you? And you're still obviously working with a ton of executive CEOs. What are the questions that you get asked the most, or help? What are the questions you get asked to help out most now in this new hybrid work environment?
I think it's really to just kind of rethink the way that you manage and really try to be more of a team member than a taskmaster. And can you get to the trust? Can you give the agency? Which some people say, no, we can't do that. Well, if you couldn't trust your person working at home or somewhere else, could you trust them working at another building or a different floor? I mean, I think it's pretty fundamental thing. And then the other piece is just thinking about this more dynamic world and just being flexible to listen and be open. and try and make mistakes, and some stuff might not work, and that's okay. And even like talking to the real estate professionals, even when they design the interior of a space, make as much of it as flexible for as long as you can. So just this whole idea that we're in a much more dynamic world. Let's be flexible. Let's not get stuck in a position, and let's keep things interesting for people.
What's your overall? I mean, what's your overall? I mean, you think this is a good thing? I mean, you think this is a good development overall, or what do you think? Or is this setting us back? I mean, what's your view about that?
No, I think it's fantastic. The fact that you and I are doing this. I mean, when I go film something in person now, the inefficiency that it takes to travel 2 or 3 hours, hang out for an hour, set up, shoot, commute back, I think it opens up a ton of opportunities. I mean, again, it doesn't replace getting together, but it certainly opens up a community and a level of engagement. For me, the big moment was the NFL draft during COVID, from the basement of Goodell's house, to kind of normalize this thing. And if you think about, not that many years ago, when it was the British reporter guy, had his little kid run in the back of his office, what a shocker that was, right? And so I think it's a good thing. I think it's opened up communications in ways that were no longer possible. I just think that especially the mid-tier managers, need help and assistance and tools and training to be able to kind of navigate the nasty transition. But I think at the end of the day, you can have more people from more places. Your TAM for talent has increased dramatically. And I think it's just kind of getting over those old biases and trying to be continuous learners, trying to adopt the new tools, trying to kind of change the way we look at the world necessarily than wondering why nobody looks at the way that we do.
Yeah. Well, I definitely agree with you about that on the podcast. I mean, I remember I used to run around with 2 microphones and drive to places and then try to get set up and have my laptop computer. I mean, yeah, it would take 3, 4, 5 hours. Now it's just a click of a mouse and we're chatting,
Right,
so
right.
It does, it does open up a lot of possibilities. And, you happen to be in the Bay Area, but, you could easily be on the other side of the globe and we could be having this conversation. So that really opens things up,
Right,
so,
right.
Sure. Yeah.
And the day that we do meet and have a coffee or a beer or whatever, we will have already had, a relationship. And in fact, you can have text relationships with people, online that can become very meaningful. So I think we have to be careful to not put our own kind of biases on things and kind of look at the data of what the reality is.
Yeah, totally. All right, Jeff. Well, listen, it's been a wonderful conversation. I really appreciate you taking the time. I'd love to check in and continue this dialogue in maybe a few years or something and see if all your predictions came true.
That would be great, because lockdown COVID was not the magic of remote work. So we'll see how it all unfolds.
This is Richard Hsu and Jeff Frick. Thanks.